In this episode, we are going to take a look at the different directories which we are getting or which are downloaded when we install the Laravel application. So first of all, let's take a look at starting with the app folder. So inside the app folder, we have bunch of 5 other folders. So one is console, exceptions, HTTP, models, and providers. But there are mostly we deal with 2 folders here. The one is HTTP and the second is models. If you are already familiar with models, so in Laravel or in any other framework, we create models that interact with our database. Alright, so in this directory we store the models. So as you can see, you will by default see a user model already here. I will explain this later, like what this file contains when we will take a look at the code level concept. But as of now, we store models which interacts with our database. All right, now in the HTTP we have controllers. So controllers is basically where we mostly store the views or the responses in our controller. So by default we have a controller, and when we create a controller, every controller will be extended by this controller class. All right, the next thing is basically the middleware. So what are middlewares? So middlewares are basically kind of protecting your application. So either if you want to display some pages that require authentication and you don't want the user to make and you don't want your application to show them as a public pages, so you apply middlewares on them. The one middleware that is very famous in Laravel, which is basically the auth middleware. So what it does is basically this protects the routes to being accessed without authentication. All right, and then we have a couple of other middlewares such as encrypt cookies. So what it does is basically whatever the cookies you store, it automatically encrypts those. So some middlewares are existing on the routes by default. Some middlewares we have to apply. Later on we will see like what do I mean by that. Then we have the verify CSRF token, validate signature. Now this is really an important thing. Sometimes we do send emails with the temporary signatures or permanent signatures, but mostly we send this emails with the temporary signatures for maybe 1 hour, 1 day, and so on, stuff like that. And when we apply this middleware on the routes, it checks if the signature is valid or not. Alright, then we have a couple of other middlewares here as well. Let's move back to the first directory, which is basically the console. So inside the console, all our commands which we create by using the PHP artisan command, those are basically the command line interfaces which works, which does not have any interaction with the web UI rather than on the backend work. So similarly, kind of like cron jobs, you are creating cron jobs and then running them. So the commands are similarly the same, which we trigger on a certain actions, but those actions cannot interact, those commands cannot interact directly with the HTTP requests. All right, so it depends upon the HTTP requests. Like if that HTTP request happens, then I will trigger this command. But this command, the command itself cannot be triggered without manually. The command itself cannot be triggered with any actions. All right. So inside the models, we have another folder which is called the providers. So providers are basically consider them as a service providers, which we discussed in our request lifecycle. Like when the request comes, so some providers generates and then they start providing the services to the application. So all our providers exist here, and we can do a lot of stuff with the provider. So for example, take a look at the route service provider. What it does is basically there is a function constant home. So what this means is basically when the user logs in and tries to access the login page. So the user will be redirected to this home page by default. Alright, we can change that as well. Later on we will see like how we can change. And then in the boot method we have a rate limiter set. So this rate limiter set is basically by default set for API. We can also set the rate limiter for our web routes. So what this rate limiter means? Rate limiter is kind of like limiting the number of requests per minute or number of hours. It totally depends upon how we want to limit the number of requests. So here you can see that limit per minute, maximum attempts 60 by user ID or the request IP. So what it does is basically this checks if there are more requests which are allowed in a minute. Either the requests are being made by the logged in user or the user which is not logged in but has an IP. So this will check if that this maximum attempts crosses, so he will, or the user will automatically see the waiting or the error page there, like the limit is accessed. So you have to wait for maybe a 1 minute or stuff like that. So it totally depends upon us. Alright, so there are other providers like event service provider. In this event service provider we register the events, we trigger emails and stuff like that. We will see like later on how we can what we can do with these files as well. So on this stage you just need to know the directories and a little bit information about the directories. Next is basically the bootstrap. So bootstrap is basically where the application loads its instance. Alright, the next is basically the important thing is the configuration. Inside the configuration, the main files we touch are the app file, then we have the database file. Alright, so these are the two files mostly we work in our application. Throughout the application, in major of the applications we work with these, and we really don't need to go into any other files. So what we does in this configuration file is basically the config folder itself indicates like this is the configuration folder. So let's take a look at the app.php first. Alright, so first of all we have the name of the application. Alright, so this is basically app_name, and where is this coming from? This is coming from env function. So what this env function does, it's basically checks if this key exists inside our .env file. Alright, if it does not exist, or if it exists and does not has any name, its value is empty, then the default name would be the Laravel. So let's take a look at the .env file. Alright, so this is basically the .env file. So env means the environment variables. Alright, so this is really important file, and all our database credentials and some other credentials that we would like to store in our software or in our application, we store them directly in the env files. Alright, so this is basically the env file which contains the environment variables. So environment variables means like the application variables that are required in our application. So take a look at here, app_name, it is Laravel. So if I change that, this name will automatically be changed here as well. Alright, the next thing is basically we have the app env, and this is set to production by default. So we have the local here. So this is basically like how we want to display or portray our application. If it is in production mode, then that should be set to production. If it is staging, then we can set to as staging, and if it is in development, we set to as local. Alright, and then we have some couple other of options like debug, URL, assets URL, time zone. We can also set the time zone. By default it is set to UTC, and if I want to set the time zone to my country, I will simply change it to my country time zone. Alright, then we have the locale. So locale means like which language by default the application should run. So by default this is set to env, but as of now we don't have any language folders exist. We will see later in the videos like how we can generate language files and how we can change the default English to maybe some other language, we will see that. Alright, and then we have the fallback locale. If that locale does not exist, then we set to the fallback locale. And then we have some couple other of options, and we have the providers here. We can register more providers if we are required to do so, and then we also do the alias of the providers or any other class that we would like to inject in our application. All right, so now let's talk about the database here. So inside the database, all the information that is coming to this file is basically coming from the env file. All right, so you can see everywhere it is written env, env, env. So env means like every information, every key here is basically coming from .env file. So that is why I am saying like this file is really important. Now let's take a look at the .env file, because these are two similarity files and interact with each other directly. So let's take a look at app underscore key. So what this app underscore key is, so basically this app key is like when you try to encrypt some string or some variable, so this app key is used in the encryption algorithm. All right, we can generate new app keys by the help of command. We will see later on how we can generate that. Then we have the app underscore debug, app URL. So the debug means like if you want to display any errors on the screen. App URL means like what is the current actual URL of our application. Then we have some log channels. We have the database here. We set the database connection, MySQL. So by default, these are the provided connections, supported connections, SQLite, MySQL. Then we have the Postgres SQL. Then we have the SQL Server. Yeah, so these are the default provided databases. Then we set the host, port, database name, username, and the password. All right, then we have the broadcast drivers here. We will see later on these what those actually means. Then we have the cached hosting files. Then we have the Redis configuration here. Now this is important thing, mailers, mail. So how do we want to send the mail? We can set up the mail configurations here as well. All right, so next is basically AWS. So if you want to integrate the AWS buckets or S3 stuff like that, we can integrate the AWS here. Then we have the pusher here. So pusher is basically a third-party application or the library which help us to creating real-time configuration notifications. All right, and one more thing is like the pusher is paid, so it's not free. Maybe sometime it is free for some time, but later on we have to pay for the large projects. And then we have the Vite here, and then the Vite pusher again. So Vite is basically like the assets bundling package. So we will see later on what Vite is and what the Vite does. All right, so this video is getting longer, and for the rest of the directories we will see in the upcoming episodes. I think so that's about it for this episode, and if you have any questions, you can ask me directly in the message. Feel free to ask any kind of questions. That's about it, and I will see you in the next episode.